2, 1. Go ahead.
This is Endgame. Today we are talking about violence in video games with our hosts, Ghoster, Itvarana, and Psych.
Awesome!
Yeah.
Yay! Thank you, Zaizu. Awesome. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, so tonight we're talking about violence in video games and kind of what the difference might be between 2D video games and immersive VR, if there is any difference. And kind of, this is something where, we want to get everyone discussing and hear everyone's thoughts on this. And this is a topic, Ibarana, that you had thought about kind of bringing up as, as an important topic. In my mind, it was interesting because obviously I'm in psychology, and so with all the mass shootings happening and everyone being like, it's all mental health, or I think at some point it was said it was all video games and all that kind of stuff. And, as we progress with technology, how are these things changing and everything? So yeah, what led you to be interested in this topic or to kind of think about discussing it?
I, growing up, have played a lot of shooter games just in general. I compete in them a little bit, not too much. And I stopped eventually, and then I in the last couple of years started picking up VR shooters, which was like a reintroduction into shooters for me. And it was just so weird to me for someone who has a lot of experience with 2D shooters to like get into the experience of virtual shooter. And I also have a little tiny bit of experience with like real guns or games in real life like airsoft and stuff. So I was just comparing all these things in my mind, and it just got me thinking. I wanted to talk about it, but never had really the chance. So.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. And I guess how many people, thumbs up or thumbs down? So we'll use, I'm going to ask you guys a question, and you can click on the emoji so you can get ready now and click the thumbs up or thumbs down. How many of you, and you don't have to answer if you don't want, but how many people here own a gun? I'm just curious what our percentage is of people that own. Okay, so just a few. And so one. Okay. And how many people, okay, yeah, a couple. And how many people have three? Okay, how many people have shot a gun before? I've actually never shot a gun, so I'm just curious. Okay, so wow. Okay, so about most people have shot a gun, but most people don't own a gun, which I think is interesting because I think some people, I feel like people who are into guns actually like really think that there's this huge difference, versus those who just play video games and they're like, oh, it's so similar. But I guess first, what is violence? Because I think we talk about violence in video games, and it's always talking about, often it's in the context of mass shootings, but like, what is violence in video games? Because there's all these different types. So how do you think about violence in video games?
That's hard to describe. I mean, when you think about violence in terms of like censorship, you think like exposed flesh or something, or well, no, I guess not, because that's you could also consider like bullying a form of violence. I don't know. I guess generally when I boil it down, it's like two opposing forces where one has to give, and it's like forceful and unwanted giving to some degree. So it's like an interaction that involves, you know what I'm saying? I don't know if I'm explaining this great, but
yeah,
like I just think two opposing forces. One of them is like forced to submit through force, usually with physical violence. You only say violence, but I don't know. That's what I think.
Yeah, like harm being caused to others, basically, in a video game. And I guess, I mean, there seems to be a continuum because, like, there's Call of Duty and things like that, but then there's, like, Super Smash Brothers, or Overwatch, which aren't necessarily killing people, but it's not necessarily as gruesome. Freeman, did you have a comment or thought?
Hello. Yes. I mean, one thing that I find kind of ridiculous is because the outrage now. Why is it outrage now? I mean, video game violence has always been there. I mean, think of Doom, blowing apart like aliens or whatever. And then you guys ever played, Soldier of Fortune when that came out, where you can literally blow off individual limbs? I mean, that's pretty
boring.
I
never played that. Yeah.
But no, it's a good game. Yeah, definitely check it out. But anyway, yeah. But yeah, so I mean, violence in VR. I mean, yes, it's just an extension of that. Yes, like Gorn and stuff. And people say, oh, that's like, it's a it's a path to become a psychopath, because it's, you can like, target limbs, target heads, whatever in Gorn. It's like, really? I mean, if you're gonna be that violent, you're gonna be that violent.
Yeah.
Well,
But
I
the
mean,
reason I wanted to bring it up, sorry.
yeah, go ahead.
The reason I wanted to bring it up is because, like, me and Everon were talking. The big thing is that, like, violent video games, they all have a basis somewhere. Whether that be, D&D, or, like, for shooters specifically, like Airsoft, Paintball, Nerf, and stuff like that. And what we really wanted to drive at was, what is the difference between playing something like those and maybe possibly, doing a VR shooter? Is it the same atmosphere? Is it the same concept? Are you having the same amount of fun?
Yeah.
Is there a difference, a tangible difference, that could lead to unintentional, or what's the word?
Unintended
Unintentional
consequences.
side effects.
Yeah.
yeah. No, I mean no, I totally agree with that. I mean, what is airsoft? Yeah, you're tagging each other with pellets. Same with, like, paintballing. I mean, fundamentally, yeah, just because you're tagging each other with, like, little plastic bits, whatever, you're still trying to kill each other fundamentally. I mean, that's what the aim of the game is, isn't it?
Maybe not mentally though,
So-
because I think there's a big thing in like a game where people know that the consequence isn't there, especially in paintball. Like, if
Yeah.
you actually thought you were going to shoot, like if you had a real gun pointed to somebody's head, your mentality would be so much different than holding a paintball gun or an airsoft gun, because in your mind this isn't a lethal weapon. But if you've ever been to I don't know if anyone's been to like a gun training thing, the first thing they tell you is act like it's always loaded, even if it's not loaded,
Yeah,
or if it looks like a
yeah,
toy.
Definitely.
You act like that
Yeah.
thing's loaded. They drill this mentality into you that this is a lethal weapon. You don't treat this like a toy, and they make that distinction because there has to be that distinction between a lethal weapon and a toy used for games. You don't want people to walk around with a gun like it's a toy. You don't want to have people walking around with toys like they're guns, because it's the same mentality almost.
And that's the question: is there a subset? So yeah, the people who go to real gun trainings are maybe not the group of people that society or some in society are concerned about with violence in video games. Perhaps it's the type of people who, if this does happen, are translating the game-like guns to real life guns and not thinking about any of those rules or anything like that, and not thinking like like that those balances and stuff like that. I think that's the key question: is what is that translation for?
Yeah, that's the worry. That seems to be like the worry that a lot of people have is does that mentality actually lead directly to mass shootings and violence? The things that we're worried about, and that's maybe questionable, because I think there has to be a lot more personally. Like, I think that, like, you need to have the mentality, like, whether or not you think it's a toy or a gun, in your mind, doesn't matter what you've played or what you have experience with. If you want, like, you already, like, as a human being, like, if you are, like, sane to some degree, if you want to kill somebody or not, right? Like, if you don't just, no one actually, I don't know how many cases there, but no school shooter has ever, like, brought his gun to school and thought, this is a game, this is a toy. Like, they want to kill these people. They have violent intentions.
That's true.
Right?
Yeah.
They don't actually think
this is.
they know that it's not a game. So I don't know. Yeah, like, so I don't know if a game can give that to somebody. That's a question I don't know. It's possible with, like, maybe a person who's not mentally stable, but it might even be possible with someone who is stable. But yeah, Doctor, what do you got? What's your question?
Then we'll get to Pika.
Well,
Yeah.
when people do this whole entire thing would be
sorry.
oh, it's just a prank, bro. Like, basically, there's like two different kind of ways people can put it. It's either A, this is probably most common, they could just, try to get out of trouble, or B, this is like an actual joke. But here's the thing: when kids kind of get like heart-shaped over wanting to just kind of shoot up something just because, I don't know, let's say like they failed a test, like, they always want to try to get off scot-free, but most of the time it doesn't work because they just can't really deal with what's reality and the consequences they kind of get. Just saying.
So you're saying they kind of want like a outlet? They want an outlet.
Well, pretty much, yeah. Like they just want to like just yeah, they just want to just go off scot-free. Like they just want to make sure like let's just get this over with and just call it a normal day. No problem here, kids.
Interesting.
Maybe. Yeah, I have a lot of opinions on the whole stress release factor of that. But Pika or P, let's what do you got?
So this is gonna be kind of diving deep. So the whole problem that a lot of people have against violent video games, especially shooters, is that it dehumanizes your other players into targets, into points. And so from knowing that, because it's a game, from the outside, the footage of a first-person shooter or a body camera on a soldier, it looks pretty much the same. And so when someone from the outside who doesn't play video games and know the difference like that, the evidence that they have to go by is is the footage that they're seeing. And then when you have all these high school kids that go complete wacky, try to get as many targets as possible during a spree, because Columbine was the first one to like really put that mentality on the map. You can see where people make the connection. So, but it's always, video game industry always fights back. So it's like, no. See, they're not actually holding a gun. They're using a mouse and keyboard, which is like entirely different. Mouse clicking is not the same as holding and pointing the trigger and stuff like that. Or holding a controller. Like it's not the same. So okay, yeah, all right. So let's say humanity has finally calmed down and they kind of agree. Let's not. But now this VR stuff comes along. Now you're actually holding a gun. Now you actually have stereoscope. Now you actually have to aim and shoot at targets.
Yeah, that's something huge that I started thinking about, because that was the first thing that I was thinking about when I first jumped into a VR shooter. Was like, this does not feel like any 2D shooter that I've played before. The idea is the same. I've got to strafe back and forth to dodge bullets. I got to aim for the head or the body. It's like the same principles, but now I feel like I'm here. Now my person has somewhat human motions. I see them moving their arms and their head. If I'm
Now it's let me reiterate. It's human target. If it was the same violence and gore against like vegetables, everyone was a vegetable, no one would have a problem with that. It's
the game still encourages you to shoot
targets.
Yeah, they're encouraging you to shoot the players though. Like it's the point of the game, right? So they are the VR games are encouraging people to shoot each other.
Why does no one have any problem with squirt guns? Like those Hydro Blaster 9000,
Right.
Everyone
and it
likes
might
those.
just be because of that whole whether or not you actually feel like this is a lethal weapon. Like it could look like a gun, it could feel like a gun, it could sound like a gun, it could shoot like a gun. The person could bleed like they're dying, but if they respond and you can hear them 10 seconds later, your brain eventually goes, I don't think I'm actually killing them. Like most people would be like, this isn't actually a lethal weapon. I think, right? Is that right?
You're desensitizing. I mean, I think I think one interesting thing, for example, is that you can treat PTSD for people who have PTSD from Iraq or other war experiences by putting them in VR and having them hold a gun and actually feeling like they're in that experience. And I think that's an interesting kind of thing. It's that they're not putting people in Xbox, in 2D kind of scenes. They're putting them with a headset and a gun, and that can treat their PTSD in 1 or 2 sessions. So this is very powerful and a powerful simulation of combat. Yeah.
A water gun could still be filled with sulfuric or hydrochloric acid.
True, and
But then
and I
you
think
also have to modify the gun's internals and to compensate for that and all that other stuff. The other thing I
Person's
didn't
no longer
mention
playing
about
a game.
squirt guns- Yeah, you're still playing a game. Squirt guns, they do, and I have heard stories of kids bringing squirt guns into school and causing issues. Like gun-related issues. Oh no, he has a squirt gun. If I could do the quotes, I would around gun. But the idea that even something as simple as that doesn't even look close to a gun 90% of the time can still cause issues.
yeah, and I think
stuff,
also at Oculus Connect, I tried a bump stock thing that like you put it up and it's like an assault rifle and it hits your chest as you shoot it and it vibrates and it's a pretty intense thing. And I think those are the kinds of things that if someone is learning, as Pika mentioned, like the motor movements as well, like ducking and dodging and practicing, like police are now using VR to train in simulations. And so I do believe that as we've seen with skills training in VR becoming a lot bigger, skills training and how to execute a mass shooting could be occurring when people are ducking and dodging and actually learning how to coordinate their bodies to duck behind different obstacles and spatial awareness. I mean, that could lead to 10 more people being killed in a mass shooting if the mass shooter had used VR, over for a long period of time. So even if it doesn't cause it, another question is whether it can influence.
Enhances
Right. Whether
the attempt, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, Rejinx.
So a few things. First, I guess going all the way back to the beginning, talking about 2D violence, I think that's pretty much, to me, the most damning thing to put that to bed is if you look at, because they specifically talk about youth violence. If you look at youth violence and even general violence across the United States since the rise of violent video games, it peaked around 1991, 1992. That was mostly because of the drug wars and the gangs in the early 90s. And ever since then, like, youth violence is way, way down. And you have to think, all of the decades before then, they didn't have violent video games. So now violent video games exist, and we've had generations of children that are causing less violence. There's less child murders. There's less children bullying. Like, if you look at the statistics, it's way down. So I actually argue that video games are reducing violence and other social things. The second thing, the only thing I've ever heard in real life that can translate, at least from 2D games, is that games that use realistic hardware that you can purchase. I do know of multiple people who ended up buying military grade rifles because they played video games and they liked it, like they liked the AK-47 in the game and they wanted to fire it in real life, so they sought out and purchased one, not to shoot other people but to shoot in their backyard. It was these people who were hardcore in the Call of Duty and stuff like that. And third thing, I think you're completely right. That's where the question is. It's the transition to a physical act of VR, and that's going to be an interesting difference from 2D games, where to me it's pretty much put to bed that it just doesn't do it. It doesn't cause it.
It's not immersive enough. Yeah. And then that's exactly good, really great points. Yeah. Deadly?
Yeah, I think he had a pretty good point. If you look at crime rate, especially at homicide with gun usage, and if you look at the player counts of violent video games, you see that they're actually moving anti-proportional. On one hand, because most of the drug wars are over. On the other hand, because the player counts of video games featuring violence, for the biggest part mild violence, but still violence, are raising. Nowadays, you rarely find a kid that's not playing Fortnite. Did the school shooting numbers go through the roof? No, they didn't. They're pretty much stable, with a mild tendency upwards, but not in proportion to the player counts of video games.
Fortnite.
Yeah, Fortnite. Especially Fortnite. If we were going after the player numbers of video games, every second school should have a school shooting at least once a week. I think the biggest problem is that people look at these events, at school shootings, at other shootings, and they are like, we need something to blame. 10 years ago, if you had somebody actually murdering somebody else and they played video games, that might have been a unique thing, but nowadays it's almost as stupid as saying, like, yeah, they are breathing, so they are a mass murderer, a potential one. Yes, of course, everybody who shot somebody else once breathed in their life, everybody drank water in their life, but I think we're looking at a very complex mechanic, the homicide, and
Yes.
trying to simplifying it and trying to blame it on one certain reason, where we can't really do that because all of those people are mentally highly unstable, and that's nothing a video game could cause.
Exactly, and that's
Right.
exactly what you're mentioning is, I think, something called correlation versus causation. You know, so like if we have two variables, like breathing and mass shootings, they're correlated. Everybody who breathes is correlated with mass shootings, or video games. Like even if every person who does a mass shooting has played a violent video game, that's a correlation. But that doesn't mean that the video game causes mass shooting. The only way that you can infer causation is when you have an experiment where you have one group where you expose them to video games and one group where you don't expose them to video games, and then you see if the group exposed to video, and you randomize people to either group, and you see if the group exposed to video games commits a mass shooting, or because we can't really measure that and it's unlikely to find someone who does that, you really just measure like aggression levels or kind of proxies for that. Exactly, like we can't just say, oh, because these rises and trends have occurred, therefore something else is this is what's causing it or whatnot.
I have a
That's
rebuttal.
right.
I have a rebuttal to
The
that.
other
Rebuttal
Okay,
to that. Okay,
and-
I'd like to hear.
You say
Also-
you say you can't measure it. We can today. Through the use of social media and all if Facebook and Google and all the data collected on every individual was released, I'm pretty sure that via I mean, I would hate to say this, but like via mass shooting, you would slowly emerge connections based on their profile behavior.
Trends, yeah. But the thing is that you still wouldn't be able to infer that causal, because here's the thing is that even if, let's say, every mass shooter has trended towards starting to play some video games and starting to play progressively violent video games, and therefore playing progressively violent video games for longer periods of time predicts...
I'm not talking about just video games. I'm talking
or
about
let's say
their entire
Yeah,
profile.
Yeah, let's say like if you had like the NSA's database of, everything or whatever, yeah, you could like predict, probably you could see trends in the behavioral patterns and predict, but you won't know. The thing is that we won't, the idea of the violence in video games is that we need to ban violent video games because they're causing it. So that's the key difference, is that you can find predictors, which means that it's correlated with it and that it's a prediction of whether someone's going to go do it. And you can probably create a profile where if someone fits the profile of all the other mass shooters, they're likely to do it. But the thing is that you don't know that by removing those predictors. Let's say you ban, let's say the people are like posting on a particular forum or like 4chan or something like that or whatever, like, some sub forum or a subreddit. You could ban the subreddit, but it doesn't mean that subreddit's causing the shooting. It just means that the people who do the shooting are also likely to engage with that particular subreddit, basically.
But I'm talking about even deeper than that.
Well, what he's saying basically is that
the,
anything
the
that
data,
you could...
the data gathered from your location. So if this individual immediately goes from school to home and then just plays video games, their GPS data doesn't show that they go anywhere else, or their GPS data doesn't show
What
that they're
he's
in the
saying is that
proximity of
like
someone
all
else.
of that data,
Like I'm talking about
all that data,
all the data.
I know all the data, like the same thing that we've just applied to video games, because everyone plays video games. All the data that you could gather on a person could be thought about the same way as we could dismiss it the same way, because it's correlation and not cause necessarily. Because whether they're going straight home and playing video games, or like who was saying, I didn't catch your name earlier, but what you're saying, like it's just as common as breathing. You can't just say, this person has a trend of breathing or drinking water or going to the library on Tuesdays. None of that is a scientific study that proves it. That's just recognizing a trend and making a prediction. To actually find a cause, you need a controlled test environment where you have two groups of people and you have one exposed and one not. That's what Psych is saying. So no like amount of spying is going to give, because your whole testing group, like if you spied on other people, all of them are exposed to the same things as your target shooter person. Like the same thing that he does on social media might be the same thing that other people do on social media, and you have no way of knowing in comparison. You know what he's saying?
If it's causing that, yeah. But you can't
Right.
predict it,
and
and
the
this
other
is
thing, too,
important.
about that
Yeah.
is that you're only collecting data on that specific person. One of the things I wanted to mention when Deadly was up was that the home environment is going to be the biggest factor.
The home environment, yeah. Gotta question that.
Well, I mean, think about it. Because if you're allowed to play violent video games as a 10-year-old, and we've all experienced those 10-year-olds who are, on Halo and Fortnite and even now into these VR video games, there's this sense of why are they here in the first place,
Yeah.
And then the second question is, oh great, now I gotta deal with them.
Have you ever heard a kid cussing out his own mother on Xbox before or PlayStation? Has anyone had that experience?
Yes.
You ever run into those kids who like they're cussing and their parents are home? You're like, who's raising this kid? That's what I'm talking about.
I've done it before, era. I rarely play multiplayer games.
Well, for those who don't know, sometimes occasionally online and in these types of games, you run into a kid, you wonder where the heck their parents are, and that's what we're talking about. Like these home environments will obviously play a huge role. The kid might not be a shooter, but he's the rudest kid you've ever met. And why is he like this? Like there's a huge factor here.
And that's sociopathy, like people who are remorseless or in that kind of stuff. And I also think, well, hold on, Screaming, I saw you had an explanation point. So did you have a point to make before we change it?
Oh, just with the correlation versus causation, there's a big point that somebody made previously where they were saying that when ice cream sales were high, violence was high. And those two actually have nothing to do with one another, but if you wanted to sort of manipulate the data, you could say, yeah, look, our ice cream sales are really high and violence is way up. Ice cream causes violence.
Ice cream.
Exactly, but that
something in the ice cream
was not the actual cause. The cause of the violence was it was summertime, it was hot, and when it's hot out, people tend to get agitated more easily, and that was what the cause of the violence was.
Or it's when Ben & Jerry's recalled the raspberry core flavor, which was my favorite flavor, and I was really upset about that.
Psych stormed in there. He was a little louder that day.
Ben & Jerry's psych.
I kicked so many bushes down that day. I destroyed so many mailboxes.
I was really upset, but anyway, but yeah, no, yeah, exactly. So we can see these factors that are correlated, but that aren't necessarily, causing it. Hello, Kevin. We're doing a show. Yeah, welcome, and it's like a talk show, so feel free to participate. And if you troll, we'll kick you though. So, but
be gone. We're talking about violence, and I ain't afraid to get a little.
Yeah. Yes.
Rona, bad.
Yes, I am new here. What's happening?
Yeah, we're talking about violence in video games, so feel free to stand in that circle, the white kind of circle area, and if you have a comment or thought, you can stand in the middle or use the exclamation point emoji.
Only on VR chat, a GIMP Pikachu can interrupt that.
Yes.
Violence is a video game. It's not ever violent, man.
But anyway, yeah, I think this is an important. The point about correlation and causation is very, very important. Zezu, did you have something to add?
Eucanix?
I did. I wanted to kind of like throw a comment of food for thought, because we were discussing how the household and upbringing of children and maybe even like teenagers has been an influence towards violence. But for me, from a personal experience, like I grew up deep rural South in America. So from like the time I was born up until like 18 when I moved out of that state, my entire life, including everyone I've known, was a heavy gun-involved lifestyle. So like my friends, like when I was like 10, I got a shotgun for like my birthday, and I was 16, I got another one. And then and this is like all my friends and stuff, like we were like hunters, and we would just, it was like recreation.
I can attest. I live in the same area. I live in South Louisiana. Yeah, everybody has guns everywhere, except for me. I'm like the only one without. Yeah.
Like everyone I've known, like pretty much my entire life up until adulthood, essentially like was involved in that kind of area. And I can say with confidence that like no one I've known growing up would ever commit an act of violence to that degree. In fact, I can almost say almost all of them would say that it's an act of disgust. Like it literally just brings shame upon like what they hold value to. And on top of it, like when I was 18, I joined the military. So that kind of just even threw the degree further. I did 4 years of that. And I mean, we were taught and like violence is only a necessity for stopping violence. And I kind of hold true to that. But at the same time, like what really causes someone to be violent? Is it specific influences such as an upbringing, or is it like a form of mentality that the person's developed for some kind of unknown variable, or is it just different for every person?
Yes, Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead, Tyke.
So you go first.
No, you. No, you.
You first, or and that's how Rejinx
Okay.
has a, I think, response as well. Then I'll chime in.
Yeah,
What
so
I wanted
it was.
to say about that.
Sorry.
Oh, Ghoster and then Rejinx. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
To you, I just lost your name, Zizu. The reason I brought up household environments is, yes, you were raised in a sounds like decent household environment. I'm talking about the ones that, you know, mother's a drug addict, dad is, you know, drinking heavily, they're never around, they're always violent, and they basically just send their kids to go play video games and get over it, get out of their hair, you know, this idea that you can just throw a kid in a video game and get him away from you for a while and try to deal with life, but in the long run you're actually not really helping them at all. I mean, these kids that are doing, you know, bringing guns to school, or, you know, doing the mass shootings, or even teenagers and adults, they all had not very good early childhood lives. And so if we can find a way to solve that, I'd feel like the crime rate of, you know, gun violence and, you know, general violence in our society, if we can solve that problem, that would help a lot. But the problem is that so many people with so many different complex problems that it's just really, really improbable.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's more or less what I was gonna say. So gun culture is more about access to guns and less about the more willingness to do mass shootings. More what Psych was saying earlier. It's homes that it's growing up in a home where they teach people to not empathize with others and to treat people like less than human, like being treated as less than human. And it makes it where people don't empathize with other humans. So you need almost a combination of access to guns and the upbringing that growing up with access to guns does not make you a violent person. That's obvious. But it just makes it where if you have the tendency to be psychotic or turn that way through a rough upbringing, that access could be very dangerous.
It's a means, yes. Yep. And that's exemplified most by one example, for example, is for suicide, which by the way is the #1 gun violence related cause of death. But for suicide, women are more likely to attempt suicide, and men are more likely to kill themselves because men use more lethal means like guns. And that's exactly the kind of thing that you're talking about, Rejinx, is like and this is what we're all talking about, is that there's not one cause to someone going out and committing a mass shooting or killing themselves with a gun. There's lots of causes. There's lots of variables that go in. It's multifactorial. There's lots of different things, and each variable has a weight ascribed to it. So if you think of like an equation, and then at the end of the equal sign, on the other side of the equal sign is like the action. So like a mass shooting, for example, there's these different variables like upbringing, whether they have access to guns, how many violent video games they played, all these different variables, and each one has a weight ascribed to it, and some might be weighted more than others for different people and things like that. And that's what adds up to the situation of doing a mass shooting or something or killing yourself. And so that's the question, is banning violent video games or banning guns and things like that. Well, we know that banning guns, I guess, would take away the means or whatever, but then that comes against the Constitution and everything. But like the banning violent video games, would that actually really, like, would that weight be so much that it would actually stop people? Or would the people who happen to be the ones who are going to do mass shootings find another way to do it? I mean, if they're not playing video games, maybe they're more likely to be going out to the shooting range and training their gun skills and getting better at shooting in real life, as opposed to the outlet of video games. You know,
will tell you, I've the most violent person I've ever met growing up to this point. Never played a video game in his life. I knew this dude in high school. He was basically like that neo-Nazi type, really violent, racist kind of guy, like through and through, like what you think of as like the bottom line of that stuff, he was that, right? The dude was like a nature guy. He would go out into nature and like camp alone and stuff like that, sleep under the stars. He had like he literally barely walked into town, let alone played a video game, right? So like almost like a perfect peaceful life at home. And in his home, I mean, I don't know, I can't say for his family, but like in his like home and his escapes and stuff like that, it was almost very peaceful, you know. But like when he interacted with people, he was violent, and it was strange, you know. I forget what I was tying it into because you said something and I always forgot what that was. What did you say earlier that I was trying to tie
different
this into?
variables like that different variables can weigh into whether someone ends up committing a mass shooting, and that if we ban all video games, it wouldn't necessarily
Oh, that's right. Yeah, so this guy, though, I'm saying this guy doesn't play any video games. He already spends his time out in nature, where we're all great Facebook moms want their kids to be out in nature, right? And this guy is still the most violent person I've ever met in my life, right? Like,
yeah.
So I don't know. From my personal experience, I'd say no. I don't think that banning games or guns would do much of anything. But I could be wrong because my perspective is limited. So.
Yeah, Pika.
I'm just really trying to drive home the point of like people don't play video games. Connecting what causes mass shootings, what causes all that. The footage itself looks the same to an outsider.
Sure.
Sorry, what did it say that? What do you mean by that?
Call that.
Like,
what?
Like when you're looking at someone playing a game,
from
and you look at like
outside.
a cop cam, you know the cop cam videos.
Oh,
you know,
yeah,
where they're
yeah,
like, where you see the cops and stuff. Like I watch cop cam videos all the time. They're like, you know, they're going around and stuff like that. And video games, when you're like playing, especially like a campaign where like the developers take a lot of time to make the characters move like a real officer or military person would, the footage does look the same. You know, from an outside perspective, you're playing the campaign of some game and you're shooting people. It looks the same as a body cam of a soldier or a cop who's going through. Because the tactics and the mentality for, you know, like Pika was saying with like targets and thinking of people as targets, it's the same, and the movements are the same.
Right.
So from an outside perspective, it looks bad.
Yes.
My screen's blank. Hang on.
No worries.
I can't.
There
we go. Okay, I'm back.
Oh, never mind. Good.
Alrighty. Yeah, I was crashing there for a bit.
One thing I did want to mention is that it kind of seems like in the VR games that I have played, the shooters and stuff like that, there is, at the moment, kind of an avoidance of using real-life places, or even close enough to real-life places. You know, like, let's say, you know, in Fortnite, they have a very comical-looking school with a gymnasium and, you know, weapons thrown about. But it looks nothing like, you know, what a normal school would look like at this time, you know, modern society. And I think that's probably a big key factor, is if Meta gets a hold of, you know, like some VR map that is hyper realistic, near, you know, IRL quality, and you tell people that this is a real location and you have them go shoot each other, then that will become a problem.
Simulating history in a way, like, because yeah, like school shootings are very relevant to political discussion right now. So if people saw that people were playing video games, not just violent video games, but also people in a realistic school environment doing reenacting a shooting for whatever reason, for the trolls or the lulz or whatever, you know, but they're doing that, you know, that looks very bad.
Simulating the future.
Simulating the future,
could happen.
or either way, they're doing something which looks very, very similar to recent events, right? Which really bugs people.
We're also making assumptions, which is interesting, that like it's possible that a cartoon school and a realistic school both can lead to the same likelihood of someone committing a mass. You know what I'm saying? So like I
don't think it
does.
Don't know. I don't think it does. I'm saying it's gonna offend people. It's gonna start some stir. You know,
I see.
like it's like the same thing as like people
perception.
making terrorist jokes after 9/11 happens. Like it wasn't tasteful. Those people weren't terrorists, but it wasn't tasteful. It was very offensive to the topic going on right now. So if people are starting to like make light of it, that doesn't help. You know, the discussion. You know, like if
That makes
people like
sense,
if we're trying to convince people that games don't cause violence, and then people are going in and like reenacting school shootings to troll people, then they're shooting us in the foot, you know, like basically. Even though it doesn't really affect the argument, you know, it's creating more of a pulling a blanket over the discussion and kind of letting people fire randomly at it. That was a bad analogy.
No. Yes.
Okay.
Screaming.
Yeah, so one of the things that especially psych with you working in the psychology field and being involved with that, one of the things that's always sort of made me a little bit curious is when you're playing a violent video game, you know, it's a simulation of violence. And I guess in my eyes, there are like degrees of violence. Video games being like a simulation of violence, and it's just sort of a visual thing you have in front of you. The next degree I would say is you could get into a VR environment where there's this full immersion where your full body is involved and you're moving and dodging. Then you would move to something like, say, like a combat sport where you're doing like boxing or MMA. And I think that there's a big like split between these things that are more so a sport or a game versus real actual violence, as opposed to something like warfare or like a street altercation, or then to the extreme with like a mass shooting or actually fighting in a war. So my question is there any kind of like psychological change? Because personally, I compete in combat sports, and I can tell you that violence in video games and then, you know, stepping into the ring for a match they're two completely different things, because there are huge repercussions to me stepping into a ring to compete with somebody and fight that person and have some dire physical consequences of, you know, getting injured, versus me playing a video game where there's no real consequence other than, oh, I lose. You know, that's kind of, and there's like an emotional reaction to that. But my question is or I guess really my point is there any way that we're able to kind of gauge the psychological reactions that we're having when we're playing a video game versus the stresses of actual, you know, real violence that has consequences? And how does that translate between people being involved in these video games and simulations and then actually going out and having this physical real world experience? Because in my eyes, I think they're two totally different things, because your mindset, they're in two different places. And yeah, maybe these simulations can get you more prepared for that, but I don't know that they don't really equate in my eyes, just from like a psychological level. I feel like they're two totally different things. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Psych, or if anyone else does, but that's something that I've just kind of been thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting point. I think that one thing is, one study that one of my mentors at the National Institutes of Health did is when she was in grad school, she was in VR and like one of the original VR labs. She did a study with 2D apps versus VR and randomizing people to a violent experience in either or like a control condition. And what she found is that the immersive virtual environment, and it looked like Doom, like this was like maybe 10 or 15 years ago, so it wasn't great graphics, and or maybe even like 20 years ago, but basically they found that the immersive VR led to more aggression. You can measure things like aggression, and you can measure galvanic skin response to see how stressed people are and things like that. And they did see that the immersive VR was more inducing that sense of aggression. But your question about like it's so far removed from actual physical combat or physical experiences, I think that's a key thing, because, and again, this is probably only something that the police know who've investigated the mass shooters, and this is something I've wondered about the trends of these people who do this kind of stuff. But I think that it's likely that there's probably characteristics where I think it's probably likely that these mass shooters are people who either are experienced with guns, and they all are people who have gone to shooting ranges and stuff, or they're people who have never gone to shooting ranges. And so maybe they don't realize how different it is. And so they're kind of in that state of hyperarousal when they go to commit the mass shooting. They've never shot a gun, they've never done this stuff. And so it's kind of that they're in that rage and in that state where they've actually never done that kind of stuff, and if they had been to a shooting range once or twice, they would be able to separate the video games and the violence that they're committing in the video games from reality. But if they've never been to a shooting range, they might think it's more close and that they're getting prepared to go do something in a different way. And the key thing being that they have to have the underlying psychopathology and mental health issues to get to that point, regardless of whether they're playing video games. Fail, I see an explanation point. If you have a quick response, and then we'll get to Deadly. And if you guys have any thoughts. And Rejinx. Okay. Rejinx, Fail, and yeah.
Oh, so all I wanted to say is that I wanted to ask, whenever they do the violence, when they did that research, I'm betting that the people who put on VR, it was their first VR experience, and people not being desensitized to VR originally, like they are to 2D screens already, probably plays a major role in that.
That's a great point. I think that's probably true.
That studies are done like that.
Fail, and if you guys have anything thoughts as well.
I was wondering, how is aggression measured in the test?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure how. I think it was a self-report measure where they like answered questions about how aggressive that they were feeling on a Likert scale of 1 to 5, and I think they also did physiological measures of like stress, of like skin response, basically measuring on the skin how activated your nervous system was, basically, to see how stressed people were. But I'm not exactly sure. It's a really good question though, because aggression is also subjective.
They weren't put through a test where they have to make a choice between non-violent and violent choices? Actions?
Say it again?
They weren't put to a test where they are confronted with a choice of violent and non-violent action?
No.
Because I think that will be the ultimate decider, other than aggression, right?
You would basically, what you're saying is you need another experiment, a behavioral experiment, where you see whether people choose a violent option versus a neutral option, kind of thing, or like how they behave as opposed to just how they feel after the game.
I'm actually very curious about the test you were talking about, Psych, where you said that the tests showed that people playing the immersive VR experience had more aggressive tendencies than people on like a 2D experience, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's weird, because my experience has been the opposite. As someone who's played competitive scenarios on both 2D and virtual shooters, the competitive scenes on 2D shooters are toxic. The most toxic thing I've ever seen in my life, maybe. And VR shooters have been strangely not. Even with people who are trying very hard and competing and stuff like this, I rarely see people get mad. Now, like when I'm playing myself, and I imagine that a lot of people feel this way, there's a bigger adrenaline rush and more stress because I'm moving my body and I feel a rush. But like actual aggression and like.
That's what I want to point out by their testing method. When you are playing a VR game, obviously your heart rate's going to be elevated. Obviously, your sweat glands are going to be activated. These are all signs of aggression because you're actually burning calories, as opposed to someone who's sitting down and using a keyboard and mouse. Their test method was wrong.
I don't know the details of the test method, but
but you're making a great point, Niparana, is that it's a true, like, again, this is why it's so complex, because there's other factors, like the fact it might not be the guns and the violence. It might be that people are screaming at each other and cursing at each other and inducing aggression because of voice chat. And it might be that because VR, you feel more present with people, you're less likely to troll because you have a sense of presence and you actually feel like you're in a real life thing. And perhaps 2D violent video games actually cause more violence in real life because of the voice chat. Like, we have no idea. And that's a really good point. Deadly, and then Lyco, and then we'll probably we're heading towards the end of the show, so we'll probably have to wrap up pretty soon after that. But Deadly.
Alright, another thing where I would like to draw a line, and I think that shows how complex this problem actually is there is a difference between games and simulations. Games on one hand had for a competitive, fun experience, while simulations want to create an as realistic as possible image of a real situation. So I think the first big mistake many people do is they just put together all simulations and games under the big word and under the big name games. And that brings us to the point. No game will completely realistically tell you how to use a gun. Saying that people learned how to use a gun from video games, yeah, okay, they know which end the bullet comes out, but I think that's relatively easy to tell. But I, for example, if you gave me a gun, I would have absolutely no clue how to use it. I would not know how to load it, how to log it. And I played video games. And I think first big mistake people do is forgetting this line. Second thing,
sorry, forgetting. Sorry, say again. Forgetting what?
Forgetting the difference between actual simulations that empower you to use weapons and games that basically use weapons as a tool to achieve a fun experience. And I think that's also the difference, or this also depicts the difference between sports and actual war. Yeah, there are combat sports, but they are fun. They are using the violence as a tool to achieve fun and don't set the violence as the end goal. Like war does.
I see where you're going with that, and I agree to some degree that there's like a distinction between game and simulation, but at the same time, that's kind of like a distinction we make for the purpose of something, like a specific discussion. And I'll give an example so you might know what I mean. Using the VR shooters, a lot of them are very simulation-like, where a lot of VR shooter games are trying to get the games as realistic as possible. Like their game or their gun mechanics have the proper reload mechanics, so you have to know where the magazine is. You have to know where for some guns you have to know where the chamber is, and all that stuff, you have to know where the hammer is or whatever. If it's a gun, I don't know. I'm not an expert, but But you get like a simulation sense, but then you go and you put that simulation into the game and give it a purpose. And now we're not only simulating how to use a gun, but now we're shooting people for a score. So it's like a combo. There's both of those elements in the game, and when we lump it together as a game, I personally like to use game as an umbrella term because I feel like even simulations have some kind of purpose. When you said there, like a lot of simulations are used to empower people to use certain tools in the real life. But even if you go and look at the real life, we could get on a crazy philosophical discussion that I won't talk about too much, which is the game theory of life. Like if we're simulating war, some people, like strategists, use and view war as like a game, like a chess game. People compare it to a chess game because even real life, the things you're simulating in real life are game-like. And it could be for anything. Even if you're playing like a space simulator, if you're, a scientist or an astrophysicist, will know that there's a game-like nature to the way pieces fit together and move. There's rules. There's always rules. And if you're playing it, there's an objective, right? So the distinction's hard to make depending on the viewpoint you're taking. I don't know if if separating simulation from game is important. It could be in this case, but I don't know if I see it right away. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, interesting. It's a line, and also realism, I guess, is a continuum perhaps that games can have, like, and that's where we get from like comparing Overwatch to like Call of Duty or something in terms of the violence, maybe, versus police simulations, which are actually like meant to be as realistic as possible.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you for
points.
Yeah.
All right,
the last question, right?
Comment. Yes.
What are the common causes of people turning into violence? Like, is it lack of parental supervision, or is it like depression, or is it drugs or something? What are the usual common factors that made the person's mental state that he is inspired by video games to do violence?
I'm glad you asked, because I think that's pretty much the bottom question of this whole show right now, is what are the causes of all this? What causes this stuff to happen?
Is it drugs? What's the most common?
You're the psychological expert on this. What do you... What do you
I think
think?
we don't know. I mean, I think we don't know. I think that there's, and I think, I think two main factors are probably, well, okay. One last thing to mention is that like there's this idea of, like epigenetics, or there's like the orchid and the dandelion kind of thing, which is that a dandelion, like basically, are we predisposed to be a certain way in life? Like orchids bloom only under certain conditions. It has to be like the perfect conditions, and then they bloom into beautiful flowers. Whereas dandelions can grow almost anywhere, and they don't need as many conditions. And so that's the same thing with personality traits. Some people could have the propensity to be very violent within them, but it only comes out if the right conditions occur. Other people might be violent no matter what conditions occur, which is more like the dandelion versus the orchid kind of thing. And so I think yeah, exactly. He probably spent lots of time in fields with orchids or whatever in nature. But yeah, exactly. Like, so I think it depends on the person. Some people are probably more likely to be sociopaths and more likely to do these kinds of things regardless of their upbringing. Other people probably have trauma that they've been experiencing. If someone's abused or something like that, that could lead to a lot of aggression and things. So I think that we don't really know, but I think it's pretty safe to say that violent video games are very unlikely to be the root cause of the mass shootings that we've seen. I mean, we don't know for sure, but I think it's unlikely. And I think it's more likely that internet communications and other kinds of interpersonal and social pressures are the ones that actually lead to that. But it's a good question.
Thank you.
Yes. All right, Catapult, the real last comment. And then we got to wrap up because, yeah.
Personally, I don't think video games have all that much to do with these mass shootings and all that. Like, how many times have you heard, like, somebody's been crapped on their whole life, and then they get a job, they work their butts off, and they stay after hours to get projects done and whatnot. And then when it comes time for promotion, they overlook them for the promotion. The guy just snaps. He goes home, grabs a gun, goes back to work, starts shooting people just because he just snapped, just lost it. Because he thought it for sure he was getting this promotion, and they give it to somebody else, and he thought he deserved it.
Yeah, exactly. And the question is like whether...
Sorry, I mean to interrupt.
I don't know. No, I don't know.
I wouldn't say gun violence per se, but definitely workplace violence does happen. I mean, hell, I saw a meme earlier today. An IT guy got fired, and he literally cut all of the Ethernet cords to the back of his server.
Oh man!
Like, he didn't even unplug it. He just started cutting wires.
Yeah, I guess if there was anything, to make you violent, workplace would be one of those things.
Yes. Well, so basically we're need to wrap up. But any last thoughts?
I mean, we touched on a lot of things. I think the question was answered before we even got to the relationship to VR with it. But going forward, I hope everyone's thinking about the ways VR shooters could at least affect other things, like we mentioned at the beginning, PTSD and stuff like that for soldiers and stuff like that. And maybe even if we wanted to get back into the shootings topic, if it doesn't cause it, does it enhance it? Those are the only things that I'm still going to think about. That's the only thing left on my mind.
Yeah. And then lastly,
Sorry,
Ghoster.
Along the same line, just the idea that VR and any one of its iterations are going to become, the new game medium that will be the most prevalent. And so with that, you kind of have to be careful of what you allow people to have, in such violent video games, like, sword and shield, bow and arrows, magic, guns, whatever you want to call it. There's like a certain line that we should draw in the sand and shouldn't cross, but people are going to, and it's kind of one of those things of either you have to get over it or punish them. So it's just something to look out for.
There's the saying, careful what you wish for.
Yep.
Careful what you wish for. Yeah. Well, we'll have to see. And then also one last thing is that sometimes there's positive to playing games in VR. You know, like even violent games, it's better than clicking. Could be better than clicking a button because you're up and active and exercising and all that kind of stuff. So, but
like
yeah,
Rejinx
cool
was saying,
guys.
might just have the opposite effect. Yeah.
Cool. Well, let me play the outro music and we will take a picture. But yeah, this is a great discussion. So thank you guys for coming on and discussing. Let me turn off the security. Hold on.
Yeah, you gotta turn off stage security.
Security is off.
Okay,
Let's see if anyone goes
not to
back.
be a self-promotionist, but I'm making a boss game level. I need testers to debug multiplayer. Do you guys want to go to it after? You want to go?
Yeah.
Oh, in VR chat. Okay, yeah, you can put that in
VR
portal.
chat. Okay,
I can't.
after the picture.
I can check it out, but I have to go to bed pretty soon. But yeah.
Yeah. I just need. It's very basic. It's very basic. All right. I'll explain the rules after we take the photo. For anybody who wants to participate, I definitely need debug testers.
Oh,
cool.
Everybody, give me your best finger guns.
Oh yeah.
Does this count?
It's hard.
Yes.
Oh, lady just missed it.
Screaming.
Just get up here and give me your best finger guns. Don't worry about it. Get up here and give me your best finger
The
guns.
nuke's about to launch.
Why don't we go for our saying today?
What are we
We'll
doing
go
now?
Bang bang or something like
Finger
that.
guns.
Picture.
Finger guns.
So-
Bang
Finger
bang.
guns.
Okay, bang
Ready?
bang.
You.
Bang
Bang
bang.
bang on 3.
Bang bang.
2, 1. Here we go.
Bang
Bang
bang.
bang.
All right, cool.
Okay. All right. So
Nice.
I need people to test my boss level. I need a stress test. So like lots of people can really help me out. Okay.
Most stressful person here. I'm here to
All
go.
right. So,
That was
I'm
interesting.
gonna drop a portal.
Yes,
Let
I
me
like this
give me
one.
like 5 seconds
Yeah.
after I log.
I was debating making inputs, but I decided against it. I kind of said I wasn't here in the beginning. You didn't miss too much.